and Section 18 is not in Dactus reus. Dactus reus can be identical, but the difference is in the mens rea. So if you have a defendant who intended to seriously harm the victim, then you should look at Section 18. If you have a defendant who seriously harmed the victim, but they didn't intend to do so, then you should be looking at Section 20 of the Offences Person Act. There's a question about Feely. So this goes back to, so I was just saying before the Offences Against Person Act, I was talking about the case of Ivy and the case of Bosch and the dishonesty element that covers all property offences, mainly in relation to theft. We tend to talk about it, but it covers all property offences. So we have 3 key cases when it comes to dishonesty and the way that the test of dishonesty has changed over the time. So the first test on dishonesty was the case of Feely. Feely was our older case, and in Feely we get the objective part that says if honest and reasonable people would consider defendant's actions to be dishonest, then he is being dishonest. Feely was then overruled by Gosch, and Gosch introduced a second subjective test to it and said, well, only, yes, if the first part of it is still, first part of the Gosch was still considering, would honest and reasonable people consider the defendant's actions as dishonest? And what Gosch did is introduce a second hurdle that said, well, did the defendant himself realize that his actions were dishonest according to the standards of honest and reasonable people? And now we have the case of Ivy, the third case, the really important case that changed the law last year. And according to Ivy, we sort of revert back to pre-Gosch Feely position, which is just to consider the objective part. So in some ways, we have reverted back to the case of Feely and just ignored Gosch in between. So that's what dishonesty is now, purely the objective part. So when you think of dishonesty, you only think about whether or not reasonable and honest people would consider the defendant's actions as dishonest. And then I have a question about recklessness more broadly as a mens rea element. So when it comes to recklessness, recklessness is one of those tests that has developed as well over the years. Recklessness is a really important part of mens rea. So if we think about overall mens rea as a, again, as a hierarchy, we have intent at the top. Intent is the one that is associated with most serious crimes, and then recklessness soon after that. So recklessness is also part of serious crimes, but it's a little bit less a threshold than intent. Recklessness is subjective, as is intent. And there's a specific question that thinks about R versus G and whether it only applies to criminal damage cases. So recklessness applies across various different crimes. So when we think about criminal damage, we follow the case of R versus G and that type of subjective recklessness. But then recklessness is a mens rea for various different crimes. So, for example, some offences against the person have recklessness as a mens rea element. We just spoke about Section 20. So Section 20 for Offence Against the Person Act, the only thing you need to show is that defendant either intended or was reckless as to whether some harm would happen. So recklessness is not limited to criminal damage, but it is an important part of various different offences. And for all of them, it is a subjective standard. So when it comes to criminal damage took a bit of a detour from other forms of recklessness with the case of Caldwell. And for a while, it was an objective standard when it comes to criminal damage and recklessness. But now that has been brought back in line with other forms of recklessness, and recklessness is subjective in relation to all offences. So when it comes to criminal damage, always follow the case of R against G and the test of subjective recklessness test. Then there's a couple of quite specific questions that go back to partial defences. So there's a question in relation to overall about, there was a few questions about diminished responsibility. So the diminished responsibility comes under Section 2 of the Homicide Act 1957, but it was just amended by the Coronation Justice Act. So when we think about the actual defense or the partial defense of diminished responsibility, it comes under the Homicide Act, but it was just amended. Some of the wording changed from, there's a minor wording change when it comes to the first part, which is thinking about whether the defendant was suffering from a disease of mind or mental functioning, and that's only really so it wasn't massively changed. There was a slight change of terminology there, but then the defense itself comes under Homicide Act. And someone else asked a question about the relationship between insanity, automatism, and diminished responsibility. And this is a good question, and I think it's really important that when you are doing your revision, I think what might be helpful, what I did find quite helpful, is to do occasionally maps. So when you're thinking about, there are various different types of defenses. There are defenses that are general defenses, there are defenses that are partial defenses. I think what might be quite helpful when you are doing a revision is draw yourself a map and think about how do all of these different defenses apply, and to what type of offences do they apply. So for most defences, for some defences there are some qualifications. So we know, for example, that diminished responsibility and loss of self-control only applies as a partial defence to murder. Then we have duress and we have necessity that apply to all offences other than murder. And then we have these general defences that you can use for anything, like self-defence or insanity or automatism. So I think what I often do, what I think is quite helpful, is when you think about these methods, sort of map them out in your head and think about where do they apply, where they don't apply, and think about also where they overlap. So the key difference between insanity and automatism is they both sort of function in a similar manner, but the key difference is when you think about the triggers. So for both of these, there would be something that is causing the defendant to do what he did. And the difference between insanity and automatism, which is sometimes also known as non-insane automatism, is that if the trigger is internal, so if there's anything that is causing the defendant to act the way they did and it's internal, so there's some sort of illness, there's anything that is internal to him, then you consider insanity. And if there's something that is external, like the defendant maybe hit their head somewhere, they took too many drugs, anything that is sort of external to the defendant, then you consider automatism. And then when it comes to thinking about defendant with any sort of mental health issues, then you should always ask what is more appropriate here, insanity or diminished responsibility. And I suppose the key thing to recognize is that diminished responsibility covers is only a partial defense to murder, so it's not an absolute defense, it's a partial defense that reduces liability. And it covers and used to stem from a recognized mental illness. Whereas when I think about insanity overall is an old term, is an archaic term, but it covers a whole variety of situations. So it covers anything that is internal to the defendant. So it covers things like even like diabetes, epilepsy, so any sort of illness that is impacting the person's state of mind, but it doesn't need to be illness related to mental health. So insanity is a much broader in some ways, and insanity is an absolute defense in some ways. So when it's pleaded, if it's accepted, the person is found not guilty by reason of insanity. But it's a very unpopular defense, it's very rarely pleaded because it still has that sort of stigma attached to it. And it also means that, for example, in cases of murder, for example, if insanity is successfully pleaded, it doesn't mean that the defendant walks free, but rather that the judge normally the judge has to impose a hospital order. So the defendant doesn't still go free, but rather they would have to be hospitalized for some particular time. So always, if given a choice in real life, the defendant would always choose diminished responsibility over insanity because it's easier to work with in courts, but it's also more favorable for the defendant normally in the long term. Changing direction from defenses to issue of consent in rape and Offence Against the Person Act. So when thinking about consent, this is a really, really, really important question. And it's really important that you know how consent functions both in relation to sexual offences and in relation to Offence Against the Person Act. But these are two very separate issues, and consent plays a very different part in both of these offences. So when you think about, if you think about firstly Offence Against the Person Act, and it is really, and you should really spend a bit of time on this, I think, because it helps to understand also Offences Against the Person Act more broadly. So when it comes to Offences Against the Person Act, consent is not a defence. So when it comes to assault and battery, common law offences against a person, you can use consent as a defence. But then when it comes to those more serious offence against the person, where there's some sort of harm or injury to victim, where we are thinking